Let's just start with this, because, Clay, there's a legal component of this that I wanted to get to. First off, here's what it sounds like. If you were to say over the weekend, walk past, if you're a neighbor of Justice Brett Kavanaugh in Virginia, here's what you were hearing. It's interesting on so many levels. One is, Clay, they're not trying to make it, they're not going to convince Justice Kavanaugh of the constitutionality of abortion by shrieking like morons on his front lawn. It's meant to be a threat. That's one part of it. And the other part of this is it's actually not legal to do this under Virginia law. There is a statutory, you cannot gather and protest at someone's home and essentially disrupt the peace, but the police aren't doing anything.
Yeah, this is one where I think regardless of your politics, Democrat, Republican, Independent, indifferent, the idea that you should be able to show up outside of someone's house in a neighborhood and scream at them. And you talked about this last week, Buck, the fact that you lived in Washington, D.C., where people were doing this outside of your apartment building, not at you, but at other people. I just fundamentally reject this. And I think the overwhelming majority of the American public does too, regardless of their politics, which is why we got this sort of awkward tweet that I thought Jen Psaki had already retired, by the way, as press secretary because she has introduced her heir apparent. But the White House this morning, early on Monday, I'll read this. This came from Jen Psaki. POTUS strongly believes in the constitutional right to protest, but that should never include violence, threats, or vandalism. Judges perform an incredibly important function in our society. They must be able to do their jobs without concern for their personal safety. So to me, this feels, they're not directly saying don't protest, but it feels like a fig leaf because, Buck, what I'm concerned about is what we started talking about being concerned about the moment this Justice Alito opinion leaked, which is violence ensuing. And one of the Supreme Court justices that is right now in a 5-4 majority being targeted for violence. And if you watch those videos and you saw those protests over the weekend in the Washington, D.C. area outside of Supreme Court Justice Holmes, you could easily see, Buck, how that could turn violent, how somebody could bring a Molotov cocktail like they did that got thrown. I believe it was in Wisconsin where that thing got thrown over the weekend, Buck, into a anti-abortion clinic.
Yes, it was in Wisconsin because they weren't doing a good. This was I believe this was yes, it was an anti-abortion group in Wisconsin, and it said, if abortions aren't safe, you aren't either, was what they wrote on the walls. That is a threat. In legal
direct
terms,
threat.
In moral terms, that is
direct
coming
threat.
for you.
And I think they're aware that this is a really bad look for them. And the politics of this potential Supreme Court case are more complicated than most people want to acknowledge. But standing outside of elected officials' homes and screaming at them, not to mention while carrying the signs that they were, the groups that were acting in that way, that doesn't reflect well on Democrats. And I think, again, this is a little bit of a fig leaf because remember over last week they refused to condemn the idea when all these Supreme Court justices were having their home addresses circulated and it was being announced that there were going to be protests at their homes. And by the way, this goes across the board. If conservatives suddenly didn't like a decision that the Supreme Court put out, I think that protesting in residential areas in front of justices' homes is just flat out wrong, period. And that is a content-neutral position that I believe the overwhelming majority of the American public agrees with.
I'm sure you saw as well, a lot of people listening certainly saw that there were these, to call them protests is actually to dignify them more than they deserve, because there was true lunacy on display at Catholic churches, including here in New York, on Mother's Day, where you had activists. You probably saw some of the video. I mean, there was one activist who was saying, I want to kill the baby, screaming, I want to kill the baby in front of the Catholic Church. And I just want to say to the left-wing pro-abortion base, keep it up. Keep showing up in churches, in Catholic churches, destroying the peace of that service, showing disrespect to the parishioners, because a lot of people are watching, including Latino voters, who, as we've all been talking about, those recent polls, 52% in the most recent polling that's out there at the national level. 52% support for the GOP among Latinos, 39% for Democrats.
And that's NPR, by the way, Buck. That's not some, right-wing organization that is doing that poll. That's the NPR poll showed Hispanics plus 13. To put that in context, white voters were plus 9 Republican. So if that is accurate, Hispanics have become more Republican in the past several years than white voters have.
I'm of two minds of this, Clay, because as we get closer and closer to the actual midterms, on the one hand, there's a part of me that is encouraged by the fact that the Democrats have not made a single adjustment, really, that shows me they're serious about trying to limit the damage of these midterms to them. They have not made a pivot where I go, they're going to try to convince everybody they're not as crazy. But then there's also this part of me as things are getting crazy out there or on this Roe issue with these activists and the threats and the going after Supreme Court justices and the leak of the Supreme Court draft decision, that they'll cheat and they'll intimidate and they'll actually fight dirty, right? So on the one hand, I see they're not making the intelligent political moves you'd need to win fair and square. On the other hand, I realize, so is this going to be some kind of a COVID play going into the fall?
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking.
They're going to try something because policy-wise, they're hitting the gas pedal as they're getting closer to the cliff.
That's a good description. On Friday, they came out and said, hey, we may have 100 million new COVID cases in the fall and winter. Now, they're trying to make that argument if they don't get still more dollars for COVID. But I read that and I thought they are laying the groundwork again, Buck, for unlimited mail-in voting, for unlimited absentee ballots, for abilities to get ballots into the election tally that otherwise would not have been allowed or considered to be appropriate, just like they did in 2020. Now, we can talk about what the tally is and whether it's legitimate and whether 81 million people voted for Joe Biden or not, right? But the reality was the biggest part of the rigged election was big tech to me and the change in the voting rights so that you could get all these mail drops so that everything was changed, and they did that predicated on COVID. A lot of people thought there's no way they can make the argument for that again in November of 2022. We're then 2.5 years into COVID, and yet when they're coming out and saying they may have 100 million new cases in the fall and winter, it's hard for me to not think that is laying the groundwork for this to happen all over again.
This is the only thing that makes sense. What you're discussing or what you're describing here, where there's some strategy, there's going to be a dishonest strategy to try to at least limit the annihilation that seems to be coming for the Democrats. Because let's just take a step back right now. Look at this Biden administration. You got record high inflation, all right? And there's nothing, usually, Clay, as you and I know from doing this, there's usually, what would the Democrats say on the other side, right? They'll have their fusillade, it's a fun word, their fusillade of talking points to support their side. We could sit here and talk about 8.5% inflation, highest in 40 years, worst war in Europe since World War II, and the real prospect of a nuclear exchange if it keeps going in certain directions. Baby formula shortages, stock market absolutely tanking, people's 401ks getting crushed, low labor market participation, any wage increases getting wiped out by inflation. I know. What am I
can
missing?
Keep going. I mean, the murder rate skyrocketing, police under siege, the border at its worst level maybe in the history of our southern border ever existing with Mexico, going almost all the way back to when we actually had a war with Mexico in 1836. Honestly, when you talk about the issues on either side of the border right now, it's almost impossible to point to anything, which is why, Buck, they've already tried to move beyond the Supreme Court overruling Roe v. Wade to say gay marriage is at stake, contraception is at stake, your ability to have kids who are gay go to classrooms. They're trying to follow that down the slippery slope because really I think all they're going to have is arguing cultural issues. But I don't know that motivates people to get out and vote when we're talking about an economy in the tank like it is right now.
They're desperate to mobilize their base in any way they can. I think they're almost writing off independence. I think this is just going to turn into, for Democrats, a base turnout operation with mail-in balloting under some BS COVID excuse, and they're just going to try to hold on into the blue areas as much as they possibly can, and realize that what could happen to turn that we're in May. I mean, it's going to be June here in a matter of a couple of weeks. So you're in the summer period right before the midterms. It's going to get better. Joe Biden's going to give some great speeches. I mean, they're lucky if Joe Biden doesn't start muttering
People
gibberish.
are going to tune out in the summer. And honestly, Buck, there's even an argument that the leak of this opinion in the event it comes out is actually going to spread out the reaction so you don't get that massive immediate, because imagine if the Supreme Court comes out at 10 a.m. on some random Wednesday and overturns Roe v. Wade, and there was no real indication that it might legitimately happen beforehand, it's a 5-alarm fire going off. Now, even that anger is likely to, I think, recede and moderate in the 6 weeks. Now, that's presuming that we don't get, which I hope we don't, a true act of violence directed towards the court, which is my fear, particularly with these protests going on and everything else. But if we get the normal release, which would have happened when? In late June, right as we get ready for July 4th. If we get the normal release of this opinion, then I think even that is going to fade into the summer. And then by the fall, everything is falling apart with the economy. It's going to be hard to argue anything matters. Like James Carville said back in 1992, it's the economy, stupid. This is an economic election in 2022.
I'm just worried. I think everything, all of that analysis, I think is spot on. I just think that my anxiety, my concern over them fighting, over the commies fighting dirty, is getting higher and higher because that's going to be I just think that's the only
option.
Play. That's the only play. I don't see another play for them at this point.
I want to tell you, Gorsuch. I want to tell you, Kavanaugh. You have released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions.
That, of course, Senator Chuck Schumer out in front of the White House. He later had to apologize for that language, but that is effectively what is being said right now as the intensity of the protest continues to grow around Supreme Court justices and even their home residences. We know they've put in fences around the Supreme Court to try to protect it. Also, this is Mark Thiessen saying protests outside the homes of Supreme Court justices are actually illegal and the protesters should be arrested. Listen to this.
It is illegal to protest outside of a Supreme Court justice's house. 18 U.S. Code 1507 says it is illegal to, quote, protest near a building or residence occupied or used by a juror, judge, witness, or court officer with the intent of influencing that judge, juror, witness, or court officer in the discharge of his duty. So these protests outside their homes, which are meant to intimidate them, what they're doing is they are tampering with a judge. You can't tamper with a witness, you can't tamper with a juror, and you can't tamper with a Supreme Court justice. It is against the law. So the Biden administration ought to have, the Justice Department has a responsibility to tell these protesters to disperse or they'll be arrested.
It's a big deal, by the way. Judicial tampering is usually treated as a very serious thing. I mean, judges in particular hate it, so that's interesting, of course.
Well, no doubt. And if we're going to talk about the Department of Justice under Merrick Garland that was sending notices that they were going to investigate parents for speaking out against their kids wearing masks, for speaking out against CRT at school board meetings, if they were going to call them domestic terrorists, this would seem to be a statement where there is clear violation of the law afoot, and you would easily be able to, I think, Buck, pick and choose a few people who are organizing these protests and charge them with violating the law here. And look, I believe in the First Amendment. You do too. They can make their arguments as they see fit, but you're not permitted, as you just heard, to do so outside of private residential home of a judge.
If this was about an argument and this was about optics, they would be gathering exclusively outside the Supreme Court, outside the U.S. Capitol, or downtown D.C. They're outside of people's homes to threaten them. It's obvious.
What do you think would be happening, Buck, if these were right-wing protesters? They would already have been arrested, and it would be January 6th, then insurrection continuing to grow.
Mayorkas's DHS guys with long guns and DOJ with long guns would be outside the homes protecting them right now.